Hey, welcome everyone. I'm Mark Tokola of KEI. Over the years, KEI, along with our friends at the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, HRNK, and the National Committee on North Korea, NCNK, have paid attention to the issue of human rights in North Korea. The publication of Ambassador King's important new book on the subject, called Patterns of Impunity, Human Rights in North Korea and the Role of the US Special Envoy, provides us with an opportunity to review how the issue has evolved and where we might go from here. So Ambassador King, as the book title says, was the Special Envoy for North Korean Human Rights and Humanitarian Assistance from 2009 to 2017. He is currently a senior advisor at CSIS, a board member for HRNK, and a non-resident fellow here at KEI. We're also delighted to have with us Keith Lewis, who is the executive director of NCNK. Previously, he was the senior East Asia policy advisor for Senator Richard Lugar. So before we start our conversation, Ambassador King, would you like to say a few words about your book?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks very much for giving me this opportunity to talk about the book and what I've tried to do. Stanford gave me an opportunity to reflect on my time as special envoy. And it was interesting after spending over 7 years as special envoy to sort of think back and reflect on the kinds of problems that we were dealing with when I was special envoy. The book is not an attempt to identify the human rights abuses in North Korea. The Commission of Inquiry, the UN Commission of Inquiry that conducted an investigation of North Korea's human rights, did an outstanding report. And they provided a lot of the details in terms of what's been going on in North Korea in terms of rights abuses. What I've tried to focus on here is what the United States government has tried to do when I was the special envoy to make improvement in the human rights situation in North Korea. What we tried to do is work through the United Nations in terms of focusing on the human rights problems. During the time that I was special envoy, I spent a lot of time in Geneva at the UN Human Rights Council. It was during that time that we were able to put together the Commission of Inquiry. We were able to get a series of discussions 4 or 5 times in the Security Council to talk about the human rights issue, which is fairly unusual for the Security Council. And it was interesting to see the North Korean response to the efforts in the United Nations in terms of attacking the Commission of Inquiry, attacking efforts to criticize North Korea's human rights. But at the same time, they were also making modest changes in some areas to try to improve their record. The other thing, some of the other things that we focused on were trying to keep information flowing into North Korea. North Korea is one of the most isolated countries in the world. We spent a lot of time dealing with how can we increase access to information in this very isolated country. Also dealt with issues and problems relating to North Korean defectors, refugees who've left North Korea, gone to South Korea, some have come to the United States, how this affects what's going on in the human rights realm. Dealt with problems of American citizens being detained by North Korea. And I also spent a lot of time dealing with efforts on humanitarian work to try to improve living conditions in North Korea. Keith has been very much involved in that kind of thing, and I work closely with him and his colleagues in terms of trying to work on those issues. So these are the kinds of issues that I looked at to try to not just talk about how awful the human rights are, but to talk about some of the things that we can try to do to improve that situation.
I've got to say, reading the book, I was struck by how remarkably modest you are as a writer. You didn't write about yourself an awful lot. You talk about the policy and about the history. And you have some very shrewd observations, but you gave yourself kind of a backseat in all this, which is probably more modest than it should have been. You could have talked a lot more about your own role.
I'll let you be in charge of my PR.
All right. Keith Lewis, what did you make of the book?
I think the book over the long term will be seen as an extremely valuable cornerstone of history of understanding related to the issue of human rights and North Korea. I mean, it's a personal opinion that human rights is often a public policy approach of selective outrage on the part of the Congress, on the part of the executive branch, Democrats, Republicans. And through the establishment of the special envoy position, which we'll get into later, through Ambassador King's book, this is a record. It is in fact evidence that there is a commitment, a long-term commitment to improving human rights inside North Korea over the long term. That this is not simply a congressional press release in response to a North Korea provocation, but this book, written with just an incredible amount of sourcing, a lot of material. It's very well done. So I think it's going to be an ongoing go-to point of reference for the long term, for scholars, for people interested in human rights in North Korea as a whole.
Yeah, and beyond human rights in North Korea issues, there's a lot more in the book. I mean, I think if people are interested in the story about how we got American hostages out of North Korea, those are some very gripping chapters.
Yeah.
I'll invite our audience to submit questions, please, either using the Zoom Q&A function or using the YouTube chat. And we'll get to the questions later in the program. So you can start submitting those anytime you like. My first question, Bob, is I was struck by the tension almost throughout the book between the principle that humanitarian assistance should not be conditioned and the fact that practically everyone, including North Koreans, assumes it is conditioned. So is the non-conditionality a noble ideal, or is it actually exercised in practice?
It seems to me that with a lot of the principles that we hold, there is always a conflict between what we'd like to do and what the reality is. Congress has been very explicit in legislation relating to humanitarian assistance that aid is to be provided in a way that assures that it goes to those that are most in need, and that the reason the aid is given is to provide assistance to those in need. It's not for political purposes. On the other hand, Congress, I would hate to say this, but can occasionally be hypocritical. On the one hand, they want it done in a way that assures that it's based only on need. On the other hand, if we were to go ahead with providing assistance to North Korea after North Korea has done some of the things that they did, Congress would be the first to scream. So it's one of these frustrations that we have to deal with, and it's not the only thing in terms of US policy, but it's one of the real frustrations in terms of, yes, we want to do it because it's the right thing to do, it's the humanitarian effort, but we've got to deal with the politics of what's there, and we have to be careful in the administration, but we've also got to be careful in dealing with Congress to make sure that we're not doing something that's going to undermine the whole effort.
Mm-hmm. And I've been struck over time too that it's not as if North Korea is eager to receive humanitarian assistance. Often it's as if they're holding their own population hostage. That they're daring us to not give humanitarian assistance because they know we want to.
Yeah, North Korea is very difficult to deal with because this is a country where there is very little impact from the feelings of the population. This is a government that totally ignores what the interests, the concerns, the will of its people are. And that makes it very difficult to deal with. The North Korean government is happy to have food assistance, but they want it on their terms. And they have little pressure to meet those conditions.
Keith, if I can turn to you, the special envoy position for North Korean human rights was created by Congress to work with North Korea to address the situation. So over time, do you think the position and the legislation have worked as expected?
Before I respond to that,
please,
I'd like to give additional perspective to what Bob just shared on this question about provision of humanitarian assistance and whether or not it's used as a tool of some sort. It's been my personal observation over the years that there really is a very significant red line that's drawn within administrations, within the Congress, among Republicans and Democrats. You have people in the United States, in the policy world, who are of the opinion that humanitarian assistance should be provided to the most vulnerable populations worldwide, whether that's North Korea, Iran, etc. In other words, even to those who are enemies of the United States. there is also that sense among many in every administration that in the pursuit of certain foreign policy objectives, it is okay to deprive vulnerable populations of food, of medicine, in fact, contributing to the deaths of vulnerable populations, that's all right because we're pursuing this other public policy, foreign policy approach. I think that divide is there. It will be interesting to see how the Biden administration comes out on this issue. It will be interesting to see which side prevails, if you will. On the position of special envoy, I think that Bob King has done an outstanding job as the position was originally intended. And this was not an easy thing. I mean, at the end of the day, Bob, if I'm correct, the original legislation passed both houses unanimously. There was no opposition. There was opposition early on from the Bush administration to the North Korea Human Rights Act and to the establishment of a special envoy. But if I recall, it was the sense of Congress that there needed to be a specific position because otherwise human rights will not be addressed by the executive branch. And so that occurred. Now, in the case of Ambassador King, he has in fact done an admirable job, I think, of being able to manage the human rights portfolio and also work on the humanitarian portfolio. But I think Ambassador King's an exception. He personally brought to this job years of experience. He had credibility with the North Koreans on human rights because they viewed him as being consistent. In other words, he was not simply a political appointee out of nowhere. He was someone who brought a track record of consistency on human rights, which is important in his own effectiveness in dealing with them. Now, when the Biden administration was collecting input on their policy review, at the request of US NGOs, NCNK did submit a number of recommendations to the administration. One of those recommendations was that if in fact the administration filled the position of special envoy in human rights, that there should be a separation between that individual handling human rights and the portfolio of humanitarian assistance. The concern being that whatever, getting back to your original point in question, whatever may be the ideal or reality on humanitarian assistance, human rights, the North Koreans are of the opinion that the United States government utilizes humanitarian assistance as a political tool. And the wording in the Biden administration that has come out lumps human rights, humanitarian together. And so if you're sitting in North Korea or if you're sitting in Indianapolis, you read that, and the optics are that there is a correlation. The optics are that the United States will not be providing humanitarian assistance unless there's an improvement in human rights. Now, hopefully that will not prove to be reality, because in essence, we're also talking about the provision of US private assistance, private NGOs. The question on the table here is not really of US funded assistance, but we hope at the end of the day that private NGOs will be able to continue their work in North Korea. This has resulted over, some have been involved there over 20 years. They've developed relationships. This is a great form of diplomacy at the local level inside North Korea. But getting back to your question, I believe that because of Bob King's focus, because of his work, because of his background, because of his unique perspective, I think that he has done a great job. He did a great job as special envoy in human rights. And so I think that he did fulfill what Congress had hoped would be the results of that position being designated.
Your comment about the NGO work raises another question, and that is about the Trump administration ban on US passport holders being able to travel to North Korea without special exception. So, Bob, I sense from your book that you were critical of that decision. Is the problem the law itself, or is the problem the way it was bureaucratically administered, where it was so hard to get a humanitarian exception took so long? Does the law need fixing?
Part of the problem with North Korea is that there's a great deal of effort that's put there's when you're dealing with how to deal with the humanitarian issues, and when you seek to make improvement in the human rights situation in North Korea, you're dealing with a government that doesn't really have much of an interest in a lot of these issues. And it makes it very difficult for North Korea to engage in terms of dealing with these kind of problems and these kind of issues. What we attempted to do was to limit the problems that were coming about as a result of people traveling to North Korea. We were having difficulty with Americans being detained, Americans being held in North Korea under fairly difficult circumstances. And this was something that began shortly before I was named as special envoy with the two journalists that were detained by North Korea. And Bill Clinton had to go there after he was out of office in an effort to try to release those individuals. And so there was a concern in terms of how do you keep Americans from going to North Korea where the North Koreans will detain them, hold them, and use them as leverage in terms of dealing with the United States. On the other hand, it's extremely important for NGO groups, particularly the groups that Keith deals with, to have an opportunity to travel to North Korea. They've got to go to North Korea. They've got to work out the arrangements for delivery of assistance, to understand the needs and to understand where the aid goes and so forth. And so it makes it a very difficult kind of situation in terms of American citizens being detained and held. What the effort was after we went through a series of Americans that were being detained is there was an effort that we ought to try to discourage people from going to North Korea to run in the Pyongyang Marathon or to add that to the list of countries they visited. But at the same time, it was a difficult kind of situation because we wanted to make sure that individuals who were there, who were working on humanitarian aid projects, who knew what they were doing and knew how to deal with North Korea, would be in a position to be able to go. The initial provisions that were put in place in the Obama administration allowed exceptions on travel for individuals who were involved in humanitarian assistance. And my recollection is that we were reasonably good about allowing individuals who had experience, reason, yes, and wanted to go. When the Trump administration came into office, there was a reversal and a tightening of allowing people access to travel to North Korea. And what happened is that it became very expensive. You had to have a second passport. You were talking about small NGOs who were having to pay large amounts of money just to get passports and exceptions to go. And I think that was where the problem was created. During the early part of the Trump administration, there were no NGOs that were individuals who were allowed to go. It was pretty much stopped completely. Is that your recollection on that? Yeah.
Yeah, if I could just add.
Keith, this is kind of your wheelhouse. So I'm sure you heard a lot from people about the travel ban. I'd be interested in your observations about that and also about whether the financial sanctions make humanitarian activity difficult.
But we only have 3 hours, right, Mark? in terms of this program. I don't know if we can cover all of that. Actually, Bob has given an accurate overview, I think, of the travel ban situation. The death of Otto Warmbier on the part of the United States government really required action in terms of the travel of US citizens to North Korea. And unfortunately, during the Trump administration, there was a decision made by some within the administration to include humanitarian assistance, the provision of humanitarian assistance to the north, and a number of other areas, to include that as part of the maximum pressure. Eventually, there was a rethinking of this, especially on the part of Deputy Secretary Began. And because of his intervention, first as special representative and then as deputy secretary, the United States did begin to reconsider its approach on the travel ban issue. At the end of the administration, the State Department was taking a look at the possibility of, rather than requiring a per trip permit, of allowing an annual permit for NGOs to apply. It's too early, really, to know how the Biden administration will approach this. We're optimistic that they will look at this very seriously. But the subject of travel to North Korea is complex because, in fact, sometimes Americans are taken hostage or arrested by North Korea. North Korea will say, well, they violated our laws. Perhaps they did, perhaps not. It's an ongoing unknown. Having said that, we also don't allow North Koreans to visit the United States. And if in fact, over the long term, we are going to develop better relations with North Korea, it's going to be necessary actually to adopt a more comprehensive approach to interaction between the two countries. Presently, it's my understanding that every administration has continued a policy, for example, that the North Koreans working at the UN mission in New York are restricted in terms of their travel without certain permission. So the travel issue is complex. It not only relates to Americans going into the North, but also in terms of North Koreans visiting here. And hopefully the Biden administration will revisit this across the board. Hopefully the administration will make it easier for US humanitarian entities to travel to the North, to work there. Understanding, and those groups know that one of the things the administration, every administration, Obama, Trump, Biden, they will be looking for is that if we're going to provide humanitarian assistance to the North, what about the monitoring? What about the end recipients of that aid? And in terms of those American NGOs who are still standing, who are active there, they have in place monitoring mechanisms once they're into the country, once they're working. But now, as you know, we're in a different world. North Korea is not allowing anyone in. You asked the question about financial sanctions. You know, the giant in the room on that front is the lack of a banking channel. And the lack of banking channel means that whether you're a UN official or you're an international NGO traveling into North Korea, that you must carry cash in to cover your operating expenses. In fact, there are some in the international community who are in arrears, who lived in North Korea, who are in arrears to the North Korean government because they had to borrow money to buy groceries, borrow money to pay rent, et cetera, et cetera. Those debts will have to be settled at some point. So the lack of a banking channel is a major issue. It is a problem not only in terms of the provision of humanitarian assistance, but it's a major issue as relates to the operation of international NGOs, the UN, et cetera. I do believe that the United States is working with other countries, with Russia, China, to try to come up with a solution. And North Korea will have to be a part of that. North Korea is going to have to be willing to acknowledge the requirements that may be set forth by that consortium of countries.
Now, you raise a very good point in saying that the Biden administration's attitude towards giving visas to American citizens is only part of the equation. The other part is North Korea's deliberate forcing out of international humanitarian workers today. So even if they decided to give visas to Americans, I'm not sure they'd be allowed into North Korea. So it's part of North Korea's issue to solve too. You also mentioned the contacts of North Korean people, how that contact may make a difference. Bob, in your book, I couldn't quite tell where you came down on the issue of the overseas North Korean workers. So this is an issue where people can disagree. So
Well,
is it good to cut off the source of funds to the regime, or the North Korean overseas workers have some exposure to the outside world?
this is one of the problems that's very difficult because it is an important source of funding for North Korea. And from that point of view, it's something that we need to control, we need to try to prevent. On the other hand, it is one of the most useful sources of funding for North Koreans in terms of basically funding the needs of their families in North Korea. I think overall it's probably, the importance of it is that it not only helps the families, it is a major source of income to the regime. They're able to buy what they need in terms of nuclear programs. They're able to fund the luxuries for the elite, in part because of that. So my sense is the benefit of foreign workers seeing what life is really like outside is probably not worth the impact that it has on North Korea funding.
Okay, yeah. Keith, you have a view on that issue?
Well, Bob has done a great job, really, of outlining the parameters of this. There are a lot of contradictions in U.S. foreign policy here and there. On one hand, what we're saying is we don't want North Koreans to be able to leave their country and see the world. But on the other hand, the United States is interested in getting information into North Korea about the rest of the world. Now, as Bob pointed out, the argument can be made that X amount of funds from that program, according to the countries, may in fact help fund North Korea's nuclear and other weapons programs. So this gets back to, how do you balance the policy priorities?
I've got one more question of my own. Don't turn out audience questions. And this is actually for Keith. I think one of the good things about Bob's book is the way it reminds us of previous issues that came up. I remember in 2015 or so, there's a lot of controversy about the idea that the US government was not allowing enough North Korean refugees to settle in the US. And there's pressure to make that easier to happen. Why has that issue gone away?
Well, I suspect in part because fewer North Koreans are trying to come to the United States. Fewer North Koreans are getting out of North Korea at the moment and for a few years. But you've just identified a topic that's fascinating. It actually started many years earlier. Senator Brownback, who actually was the Senate champion of the original Human Rights Act. Sean Wu of his staff worked with Frank Januzzi of Senator Biden's staff, with me, with others. So Brownback very much was at the forefront of not only the North Korea human rights legislation, but this Senator Brownback also wanted North Koreans to be able to come to the United States. Well, once this became clear in terms of legislation, there was concern initially that as North Koreans escaped, as they made it into Thailand or to other countries, as they approached the US Embassy, there was concern, is the State Department actually informing them of their option to go to the United States as opposed to South Korea? That was one point. Second point, however, over the longer term, while many North Koreans desired to come to the United States, at the end of the day, I think that there was this sense that South Korea was more culturally similar, might be a better place to try to assimilate. But there's a final point that we pursued when I was working in the Senate, along with some others. And the concern was that, I mean, we all know that people who leave North Korea, people who are refugees, who are defectors, who make it to other countries, by the time they get to their destination, they've experienced considerable trauma along the way. And one of the key questions was, for those coming to the United States who made it here, while the American doors were open in terms of churches, homes, at that point in time, the State Department was not able to convince the Congress that there was also adequate an adequate safety net in place for these individuals in terms of counseling, in terms of helping them to work through the trauma that they had experienced along the way. Now, to what degree does that exist in South Korea? I leave it to others to comment on that, but that's some additional background, Mark, on that subject.
Please, because in your book, Bob, you talk about the fact that although there are good reasons North Koreans didn't come, you still thought there were things the U.S. was doing to make it a little more difficult than it should have been.
The U.S. has been fairly good about North Koreans. I mean, I spent a lot of time visiting places where North Koreans were being vetted, those who were interested in going to the United States. I met a number of them. The real problem is that these people don't have English. They're limited in terms of their exposure and their experience. But the other thing is the United States does not have a good reputation in North Korea. I remember meeting one woman who had left North Korea and had made the decision in Thailand, where she was being held, to go to the United States. We had a long chat about why she decided to come to the United States and why others did not. She said, when I was in high school, the last day before everybody finishes the school year, we have a big sports day. And the grand finale for that event is we have a big bonfire and everybody gathers around and we sing and do various other things. And the climax is when we take the effigy of an American soldier and throw it into the fire. This sort of hatred of the United States, which goes back to the Korean War and which has been encouraged and fostered by North Korea, creates an attitude in North Korea among everybody, including people who leave North Korea, that the United States is not that friendly a place to go. There's also an element that the South Koreans are far more generous in dealing with refugees than the United States. We have programs. We treat North Koreans who come to the United States very much the way we treat other refugees. We provide opportunities. They're limited opportunities. It's primarily through NGOs that they're given help to readjust and so forth. In South Korea, it's a far more generous program. The woman that I talked with who'd made the decision to come to the United States finally ended up going to South Korea. Before she finished her vetting, she finally said, I'm going to South Korea. It's a tough decision. Americans are anxious to have North Koreans come here. But I think the real concern is that these people feel much more comfortable going to South Korea than they do to North Korea.
And your descriptions of the courage it takes to make the decision to leave North Korea is one of the striking things in your book. Yeah, I should stop being selfish. I've got a lot more questions I could ask, but the audience is sending questions in. The first one I have is from Alexis Dutton for Ambassador King. She thanks you for your lifetime of work. What she asks is, how can we send books to the people of North Korea who could benefit from them? What kind of books would be best? And I know that books are actually not on the sanctions list, so in theory, this should be possible.
North Koreans are very attentive to what comes into the country. You can send books, but my guess is the only ones that will be really helpful are ones that are in Korean. They're not going to have, it's going to be difficult for North Koreans to access them. I'd say there are probably other things that are more useful and more productive. One of the things that has been helpful is one of the groups that was involved in some of the NGO activities in North Korea, the PUS, the Pyongyang University of Science and Technology, which had a library, which had books, which had access to the internet, which North Koreans do not have, obviously very tightly controlled, but there were ways that students were able to access information that average North Koreans were not able to get to. And it seems to me that that would be a more useful way to do it, because you have some ability to control what information is there. The North Koreans are obviously keeping an eye on it, but it does provide access to information. Books are tough. The real thing that North Korea needs in terms of getting information is radio. Unfortunately, because there is no internet access, there's no internet, there's only an intranet, which is carefully controlled. Radio is the most important source of information into North Korea, and it's difficult to get through because North Korean efforts to block it.
Ed Baker asked a question. I guess maybe this could be for both of you. He asked, how much does the need not to provoke Congress interfere with providing humanitarian assistance?
Congress provides the funding. They're very concerned about what happens, and they have very careful oversight of what's spent and where it's spent and what it's done, and that's what they're supposed to do. It's very hard to keep Congress out of these kind of decisions. My sense is the most important thing to do is try to educate members of Congress about what's going on. Keith has long experience in terms of working with members of the Senate who are doing that. I dealt with a lot of House members who are in the same situation. It's tough. But that I think is probably the most important part.
Actually, your question was the purpose of my first trip to North Korea in 2002, because there was going to be a debate in the Senate on food aid to North Korea, et cetera, but this related to US funded, government funded assistance. And so Senator Lugar wanted a closer look. Today, it's my personal opinion that the Congress of the United States would not vote in favor of US funded assistance to North Korea. At the same time, as of today, the Congress, and Bob may provide additional perspective, but it's my sense that the Congress is not opposed to the provision of private NGO humanitarian assistance to North Korea, as long as the NGOs have a monitoring mechanism in place, as long as they are able to demonstrate that the assistance gets to its target recipients.
Yeah, this is maybe the fundamental question, is the desire to help the people of North Korea without strengthening the regime. And trying to untangle that has always been a tension in trying to deal with North Korea. Roberta Cohen asks, the UN General Assembly resolutions define the most vulnerable populations in North Korea as including prisoners. So how can we implement aid in a way that assists the political prisoners in North Korea?
That one's a very hard one because North Korea is very sensitive about individuals who are being detained in North Korea, the prisoners, particularly political prisoners, which are the ones that are of greatest interest. It's not an easy thing to do, and I'm not sure how one does it. North Korea does not want to allow access to people in prison, and that's part of what we do if we're going to be providing assistance, is try to be able to see that they're getting the assistance. One of the things that that I think Keith has indicated is a good way to go is trying to use private NGOs. Private NGOs have had remarkable success in doing a lot of very good things, whereas the US government programs have been much more difficult in terms of reaching particularly people in prisons. One of the things that I think is particularly important with regard to trying to help prisoners is making information available about how they are treated and what's happening to them. The North Koreans are not as responsive to public pressure as democratic governments, but they do have some, they do respond. And I think the best thing we can do in these cases is to call attention to the problems. The accounts of individual experiences in North Korea are an important part of raising the level of consciousness of what's going on. And that, I think, is one of the best ways we can do it. I think through United Nations efforts, providing health care to prisoners and that kind of thing is something that we ought to try to do, and we ought to work through the UN to do. I think it would be very difficult for the United States to be doing this directly.
I would simply add that, in my opinion, Roberta's question gets to the heart of an eventual peaceful resolution of the situation with North Korea. I say that because the Congress has signaled very strongly, the Congress has acted, that any resolution that requires congressional approval, if we're talking about Senate treaty sign off, the Senate's not going to go along with a treaty that might be agreed to under any president unless there is human rights improvement in the North. The North Koreans know this. The North Koreans, sometimes they will say they want a treaty, but then when they're reminded that, well, that requires Senate sign off, oh, well, and so this requires an approach, a diplomatic approach on the part of the United States and or other countries. Yes, denuclearization is at the top of the list, understandably, but to address that issue, to actually engage with North Korea, seriously, it's going to require a comprehensive approach, sitting down and across the table from them, covering a number of issues important to them, important to us. Human rights will be a part of that. And finally, I would add, as Bob referenced earlier, there has been some movement on North Korea in the area of human rights in recent years. We are seeing, not only on the part of the UN, but other efforts, we are seeing movement on their part, their effort to understand more what needs to occur. Having said that, this really does need to continue. But for that to continue, the United States needs to incorporate human rights as part of this much broader agenda with the North.
Well, that raises the tactical question. Is it better to highlight the worst of North Korea's human rights abuses to make sure people are aware of what the situation is? Or is it better to try to make marginal progress in North Korea on rights of disabled, the rights of elderly, rights of children, doing a step-by-step process?
Well, you know, this is it's a wonderful question because it really points to many in the United States who are of the opinion that the human rights situation in the North will not, in fact, improve until the Kim Jong-un regime is gone. Now, what those people aren't asking themselves is what comes next after Kim Jong-un. We don't know the answer to that. And so this is a tough question. We don't know enough about North Korea's command and control situation. We don't know enough about how they would respond to certain crises. And so it's important I think the world knows about the situation. The question is, how do we resolve this? How do we work with North Korea to resolve this? They are making some progress. They need to do more, but we also need to approach them in a way where they understand, and this gets back to Bob King serving as special envoy. He brought to the table experience and a record in human rights. They viewed him seriously because of that. And so since the United States is now being consistent on this issue, I think over the long term, this will help to resolve this, not immediately, but over the long term.
The one area where North Korea has made some progress is in the area of people with disabilities. And the North Koreans did this in part because it had little political ramifications for them. In fact, there were probably some of the elite who had children who were disabled, and it made perfect sense. What I think we need to do is press the North Koreans on areas like that where they're going to respond and encourage them and commend them for those efforts. But I think at the same time, we need to press the North Koreans on other areas which are more sensitive, but encourage them to make progress in those areas as well.
Okay, our time is coming to a close, but I need to ask one more question because it's the first question that everybody always asks. I think I can predict your answer, but the details would be helpful. The question is, does raising human rights concerns in North Korea obstruct progress on denuclearization?
North Korea is one of the most difficult countries in the world to deal with. It is a country which is very insecure. It is insecure because North Korea has, across the southern border, a South Korea that has twice the population it has. But South Korea is a member of the G20. It has what, 12th or 13th largest economy in the world. It is a country whose former foreign minister was the Secretary General of the United Nations. It's a country which is involved and engaged and respected internationally. And then you have North Korea, just on the other side of the border. It is a country that has 25 million people, half the number that you have in South Korea. But it is a country that is much, much worse. It has an economy the size of some of the more troubled countries of sub-Saharan Africa. It is a country which very clearly, if the government were not there and did not have a huge military force in place, would end up like East Germany did. It would become part of South Korea. And the result is you have a regime that is paranoid. And they are very concerned about maintaining control, maintaining their existence as a separate country. And they're very aggressive in terms of trying to expand, because the only way they can maintain that control is to dominate South Korea as well. And the result is you've got people who have, it is a very troubling situation and not an easy one to deal with. And it's risky because of the military potential for serious, serious problems. And under those circumstances, a regime that's as concerned, as paranoid as North Korea, it's hard to engage them the way we do other countries. We've got to do it. It's part of the situation. We've got to deal with it. But the important thing is we've got to deal with it in the context of our relationship with South Korea, which was one of the most important allies that we have in the world today. And one of the countries that we share a great deal in common in terms of our economy, in terms of our commitment, our economic views, a lot of the political views. North Korea is not going to be an easy solution. We're going to have to work on it, and it's going to take a while, and it's going to be very difficult.
If I could just quickly add, President Bush and President Obama emphasized human rights as part of their North Korea policy. President Trump took the opposite approach. He did not include human rights as part of his North Korea approach. The denuclearization of North Korea did not proceed under any of those presidents, despite the different approaches on human rights. At the end of the day, human rights needs to be a part of a much broader approach to North Korea, a range of issues. If we try to deal with North Korea on the nuclear front head on, it will not work. If we try to deal with North Korea on the human rights issue head on, it will not work. It requires going back to the North Korea working group that Richard Armitage pulled together in 1999. Armitage at that point emphasized the need for a comprehensive engagement approach to North Korea on a multitude of security and other issues. Ultimately, if we ever get there, we may see some progress.
Okay, as you said, Keith, we could have talked for 3 hours at least, but I hope we can resume the conversation at a future date. So let me thank you, Keith, and thank you, Bob, for a terrific book and a very interesting conversation. I would highly recommend this book, not just for people interested in the Korean Peninsula or human rights, but about American foreign policy, how it's conducted by a practitioner. It's a fascinating read. To our audience, thank you for tuning in. For seeing more news and commentary, announcements of future events, I would refer you to our website at keia.org. So thank you very much for joining us.